Good morning. This morning I'll continue with the Kokun ranks of Tozan, the ascending 5 ranks, which is, I started last week with shift, and today is submission, and the third is awakening, and the fourth is collective awakening, and the fifth is absolute awakening, and we'll get to those. So this one is submission, or we could consider it to be letting go as well, or even surrender, So we'll talk about that. But first I'll read the verse and then I'll get back to that later on. But the first line is, "For whom is the elaborate toilette really done?" And there's several other translations, like, "For whom do you bathe and make yourself presentable?" And another translation says, "For whom do you wash your face and apply makeup?" Okay. So the second line is that the cuckoo's call urges the traveler to turn home. And the third line, its note continues when myriads of flowers have fallen. And the last, calling further, deep into the intermingling peaks. So there's all kinds of submission, and in terms of our practice, the submission means to submit to the Buddha way of realizing emptiness. By submitting to the practice of discarding our cherished ideas and attachments. And this, in a way, is the same as submitting to not knowing. When we think we know something, we begin to feel comfortable, and it gives us a false sense of superiority, which actually is covering up our insecurity. So this title I mentioned, is letting go, submission, could also be translated as serving. So the vassal serves the Lord, and we serve our most honored nature by forgetting ourselves in the activity of service, by casting off our attachments to our habit-ridden consciousness. And we also serve the most honored nature of others by identifying everyone and all things as ourselves. In the Zen Peacemakers, there's a 3 tenets practice, which is not knowing and bearing witness and acting in a compassionate way. But by practicing not knowing, you continually set aside fixed points of view. Not knowing is a flash of openness, or a shift to being present in the moment. So the dropping away of the things you've relied upon for a sense of stability may lead you to examine what you believe. So recent times in particular have thrust many people into a state of not knowing. After the election where Trump became president, one of my students said, "These days things are so destabilized that it's hard to even find the center." So many of my mental yardsticks of how the world works have been called into question or have just unraveled in front of my eyes. It's hard to get my bearings with this new world order. All frames of perspective seem unstable to me. Well, as we all know, things continue to become more divisive and more unstable in this country. So in this world of instability, where is shelter to be found? So not knowing allows us to take shelter in that empty place before anything arises. A place of emptiness and profound silence. A place of the deepest rest where self-interest has not yet entered. This is not a void, but rather a darkness where things have not yet differentiated or seen. So through your practice, you can go into this space and become like an empty vessel, empty of point of view and preferences. An empty vessel refuses nothing and receives everything that's coming at it from all directions. By practicing in this way, you can create more space to accommodate your own reactivity and the points of views of others. So it should be pointed out that the not favoring of viewpoints that arises when one practices not knowing does not demonstrate a lack of caring. Rather, not favoring any one thing over another allows you to center yourself within a boundless net of interconnection and to expand your circle of caring. My teacher, Maizumi Roshi, would sometimes say, I don't ask you to give up your ideas, but at least set them aside for a while. You can pick them up again later. In this way, the practice of not knowing can align you with the ever-changing, interconnected reality called life. Practicing not knowing may seem impossible to do, and yet, when you realize that life excludes nothing, practicing not knowing over time will enable you to be more aware of what you choose to let in and more open to what you had previously excluded. So like I emphasized, not knowing is a kind of submission. In his fascicle, The Awesome Presence of Active Buddhas, Master Dogen said, thoroughly practicing, thoroughly clarifying is not forced. It is just like recognizing the shadow of deluded thought and turning the light around to shine within. That's what we talked about last time too, turning the light around to shine inside. The clarity of clarity beyond clarity prevails in the activity of Buddhas. This is totally surrendering to practice. To understand the meaning of totally surrendering, you should thoroughly investigate mind. In the steadfastness of thorough investigation, all phenomena are the unadorned clarity of mind. So by thoroughly investigating our mind, we see where we're holding on, where we don't need to hold on. And quite often this holding on is what's causing us our own discomfort and lack of equanimity. A monk asked Tozan, "What does submission mean?" And Tozan said, "What do you mean when you turned your back?" What do you mean when you turned your back? And then this is clarified a little bit, when you turned your back on the real. And the real sometimes is a word in these five ranks, means emptiness. What did you mean when you turned away from the reality of your life? So, what kind of submission is it when you turn your back and pretend to not see or do not want to get involved? So if you ignore the issue or your problem, it won't go away. So in terms of letting go, there are some things that we can let go of and others are more difficult. So letting go of the thoughts and identifying certain feelings with the notion that we're an ego or a self-contained self are the most difficult to let go of. So returning it again to Dogen, he said to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. So as long as you hold on to the belief that there's a separate self, you won't clearly see. It's very difficult to let go of it because it takes courage to let go of the notion of self. You might think, if I let go of the self, how am I going to function? How am I going to know right from wrong? So we spend most of our energy trying to protect the self or aggrandize it one way or another. But Dogen says if you forget the self, then you'll be enlightened by the 10,000 dharmas. If you let go of your attachments to the idea about who you are, then all phenomena, the 10,000 dharmas, will reveal your enlightenment, your wisdom. "24/7. You can't avoid it. Once a student came to our Indian ancestor Upagupta, and he asked to be ordained as a disciple. And Upagupta said, "In order to be ordained, you must believe in my words and never disobey my instruction." And the man agreed. And Upagupta, who had special powers, he conjured up a precipitous cliff and made the man climb up to a tree on the edge. Then Upagupta instructed him to release his foothold. The man did so. Then he instructed him to let go of one hand. The man did that. And then Upagupta instructed him to let go of the other hand. And the man exclaimed, "If I let go of this hand, I'll fall over the cliff and die." And Upagupta said, "You had promised to follow my instruction. How can you disobey me?" At that moment, the man took the plunge, let go of his hand, and fell. But he no longer saw the tree or the cliff. And suddenly he awakened, to his true nature. Of course, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's just as a story, just shows where we're holding on. But it does remind me, he thought if he let go, he would fall to his death of this. I've mentioned this many times, of this effective trap for monkeys that I've read about in India, where they take a coconut and hollow it out with an opening in it so that the monkey can put its hand in, but then when it makes a fist, it can't withdraw the hand. So they take the coconut and tie it to a tree and put in some kind of a bait or something shiny or whatever the monkey wants, and it'll stick its hand in and grab it, and then it can't release it and it can't get away. And of course, in a different way, all it has to do is release, and it'll save its life, but it's going to be captured if it doesn't release. Whereas the disciple of Upagupta thought that if he released, he would die. So here the monkey, if it doesn't release, it's probably going to die. So maybe you can take these analogies into your own life, and they might have some meaning. So we can believe in whatever we want. We have all kinds of ideas. We make up all kinds of things in our head about what it is to let go, to be free, to be unencumbered. But no matter how much we think about it, that's not it. You have to actually do it. And what is it that keeps us from taking that step into the unknown? My own life, back in the spring of 1972, which was 50 years ago, I attended my first 7-day session at a home for retired Catholic nuns in Litchfield, Connecticut. The session leader was Edo Shimano, who we called Tozan. He wasn't a sensei or a Roshi at that time. And it was also attended by my first teacher, Socho Roshi. And it was my first experience of total surrender, total submission. So when the Buddha seated himself beneath the Bodhi tree prior to his enlightenment, he made the following resolve: let only skin, sinew, and bone remain. Let the flesh and blood dry in my body, but I will not give up the seat without attaining complete awakening. So that was his complete surrender when the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree. So this Litchfield session was my first 7-day session. I had sat for 5 days with Socho Roshi, but I had not sat still the entire time. So when the bell rang, signaling the beginning of this session, I made the following resolve: I will not fidget, change my position, or move during any sitting period for these 7 days. That was my complete surrender. Not quite as dramatic as the Buddha's, but it's what I could muster at the time. But Tozan didn't make it easy. In the morning, we would get up at 4 a.m. and join a line of meditating walkers who followed a path in the nunnery along the Stations of the Cross. And it didn't escape me that I was walking up Mount Calvary to my own crucifixion. The length of the sitting periods was pretty predictable with Socho Roshi, just as they are here. We would sit about 30 minutes and then do walking meditation for 10 minutes, and then another 30 minutes of sitting, and so on. Tozan varied the sitting periods. Sometimes they were 20 minutes, or sometimes they were 100 minutes. When we sat down, we didn't know when the bell would ring to signal the end of the sitting period. I felt as if I had entered Dante's Inferno. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. I had no option but to put myself totally into my zazen. The zazen was strenuous much of the time. My legs and mind kept telling me to bolt and run with abandon into the snowy woods that surrounded the nunnery. But I remembered my vow not to move or fidget. At times, the body would break into a profuse sweat, or I had to grit my teeth against the pain, and then it would happen. I was suddenly floating in space with no pressure at all on my joints. My body had disappeared, and it felt like I was drifting between the stars. I was the space. I was the stars. All pain and suffering had disappeared, completely evaporated. Where it went, I did not know, and I did not care either. But I could breathe again and feel the breath pass through my body like the wind through the trees. There was always an awareness noticing everything that was happening. That awareness reassured me that there was a huge subjective element to pain. If I could only relax and allow the pain to wash over my body, I would experience these moments of bliss more often. Well, I didn't know that I was kidding myself, because in the next moment, the pain would return with a vengeance, and it went up and down like this for the whole 7 days. Finally, it was the last day, the last hour, the last minute. At the end of session, there's a ceremony called the Great Release, or Daikaijo. It felt like a great release. It felt like the steam had escaped from a pressure cooker. Everything was light and airy and radiant. I vividly remember the bus ride back to New York City. I noticed the new leaves on the trees, the reflection of the sun off the small streams along the way, the billowing clouds that seemed alive, and even the noise and congestion of the city had its charm. So that feeling stayed with me for days. My session in Litchfield was a turning point in my life and practice. I knew that there was no turning back. Zen was my path. So let's look at the lines of Tozan's verse. For whom is the elaborate toilette really done? So sometimes when you come to session, or maybe even come to sit, you have to make elaborate preparations. You may decide to purchase a robe or a zafu in order to create the best environment for zazen. When you come here for session, somebody's always prepared flowers on the altars. And all of you at various times have vacuumed the zendo and dusted the altars. Why and for whom? Of course, you know, this line refers to the ladies of the court who bathe and put on makeup in order to present themselves to the royal court and the emperor in particular. In this case, what is the emperor? Or in this case, what is the true emperor? Why are we preparing ourselves? The second line says, the cuckoo calls, urge the traveler to return home. I read Aiken Roshi wrote that the voice of the cuckoo is true nature itself. Our true nature is calling us to find our true nature. But I have another interpretation of this line. I have heard that the cuckoo's call is mournful, that if one is despondent or feeling low, the cuckoo's call gives rise to melancholy. And most people come to practice because they're feeling pain. They're feeling separation. It's that feeling of separation that calls us to find our long lost home. So this is one of the initial stages of practice, because there is still a belief that we can return to our long lost home. Those of you who have engaged in Great Heart Zen know that you have to turn to the cuckoo's mournful call in order to find your long lost home. Without going through the dark night of the soul, or without entering the dark cave of demons, you will not find the peace and comfort of your original place. When you totally penetrate into your sorrow, that dark cave of demons transforms into your long lost home. The third line says its note continues when myriads of flowers have fallen. In other words, the note of the call of the cuckoo. So the myriad flowers represent our attachments. Even when many attachments have fallen, the mournful call of the cuckoo continues. Why is that? There are still doubts and uncertainties. Things are not clear. It's still easy to get hooked by our cherished opinions. Recent national events have shown how divided our country is. It's probably the most divided it's been since the Civil War. I read a news columnist who wrote, "We don't just disagree on what America should be doing, we disagree on what America is." He also mentioned that his problem with Trump and the Christian fundamentalists who supported him is not their spiritual energy, but the way in which he and they use religious energy to promote separation and intolerance at home and abroad. A friend sent an email to me from Brother David Stendelrost, who's a Benedictine priest and a peace activist, and he started out his letter by saying, "Not since March 13th, 1938, when Hitler invaded Austria, have I been listening to the radio with such pain. Then as last night I saw the world take a dive into darkness. Yet this morning on our website, which is www.gratefulness.org, the randomly generated word of the day happened to read, 'The same pain that can blemish our personality can act as a creative force, burnishing it into an object of delight.'" That came from Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan. So Brother Stendelross said, "Change comes little by little. War and tyrannical governance can silence thousands of voices in a single blow, whereas peace is achieved one person at a time through a series of friendships." So it's not only government that we can talk about this way. Each one of us has a war going on inside. Even though we continue to drop away myriad cherished opinions and attachments, more remain. Even though we step forward from the top of the 100-foot pole into the unknown, there are more 100-foot poles to step forward from. The mournful cry of the cuckoo remains as long as we believe that if only the world were perfect, according to my view of the world. But the last line says, calling further deep into the intermingling peaks. This cuckoo keeps calling us to move further. So there's one secret teaching of Zen that I've shared with many of you. So I'm going to share it again. It's just keep going. Just keep going. Vow to penetrate further into your practice in order to clarify your life as the enlightened life. Even in the most difficult circumstances, when you feel isolated due to malice of others, when you feel misunderstood by your family members, when you feel pain of the violence and intolerance in the world, the cuckoo is calling you to go further into the intermingling peaks. Not just any peaks, but the peaks that interact with other peaks, that overlap other peaks, that support other peaks. If you keep making the right effort to function from that original place, that true self, then you will be more and more appropriate to each situation. There's a wonderful story about a monk who was very simple and overheard some other monks talking about enlightenment, and he very much wanted to get in on their secret. And they said the first thing he had to do was give them something. I think it was to prepare a meal, and then they would tell him. So after he prepared them the meal, they told him to sit in one corner of the room, and they bounced a ball off his head. And they said, now you have achieved the first stage of arhatship. And then they put him in another corner and bounced a ball off his head. They said, now you have received the second stage. And then they did this in all four corners of the room, and by the time they got to the fourth corner, he had experienced wonderful enlightenment. Just because of that sincerity, that innocence, that openness, and his willingness to surrender or submit, he opened his Zen eye. He was willing to be stupid, willing to be dumb, willing to fail, willing to be vulnerable. When children are learning to walk, if they had any awareness of what it meant to fail, they would never learn how to walk. They constantly fall down. Sometimes they hit themselves on the door or the floor, and they cry for a while, and then they get up and do it again. Little babies give us a wonderful lesson. They just don't give up. Master Dogen said that the 1,000 failures become the one success. 1,000 failures. Without those 1,000 failures, there can't be the success. And here's another quote from Einstein who said that in order to be successful, the scientist has to be willing to grope in the dark for many years, being foiled at every turn, having no success, just to be willing to do that. Of course, success and failure is a funny way to talk about it. I'm talking about Zen because Suzuki Roshi said if you're trying to attain something, right there your practice has gone off course. Yet, the cuckoo is still calling and urging the traveler to return home. That's enough.